It's very pleased, and it's a delight for me to be starting another 12-month cycle of the Jyotish journey, and to have all you folks participate, many of you, for maybe the fourth year in a row, right? And the last two publications that I've sent out, which was Proper Points of Prosperity, and then the one before that was the 11th part of Glory and Gains, have both been articles about interpretive principles and concepts that were pioneered by an Indian astrologer named Seshadri Iyer. And they're not, you might say, parts of what's called pure classical Jyotish, which is more of what my teacher K.N. Rao taught. What I mean by that is, you know, D11, you cannot find D11 in Parashara or in Paladipika. These are, you know, Sanskrit classics having to do with Parashara Jyotish, or the idea of using the yogi point or the duplicate yogi as an additional means for assessing financial matters. But, you know, I grew to respect Seshadri Iyer's work. And of course, I had a lot of respect for a man by the name of Hart Defoe, a teacher of Jyotish, who very much utilized these interpretive principles and concepts. But like anything with Jyotish, I didn't just accept it based on someone saying that it's true. I always wanted to validate that for myself through my own researches. And so that article on D11, which I used more than 100 charts, and I did that very purposely because that becomes more of a statistically significant sample pool than, say, 5 or 20 charts, which is what I normally use in an article. And I wanted to see to what degree that principle is going to apply. Now, as you all know by now, no interpretive principle in Jyotish always works 100% of the time, right? Because things get modified based on other factors, right? There are counterindications. But under optimal circumstances, if a principle works, say, 60, 70, 80% of the time, then we can understand it to be a valid principle. And this was the kind of thing I was looking for with regards to both the idea of using D11 and also the yogi and duplicate yogi as an additional means for assessing financial matters, right? And so you've seen the articles, I assume you've studied the articles, and so this webinar is going to be associated with those. We're going to be looking at charts with those concepts in mind in particular, but then obviously this is a webinar on Jyotish. We're going to be discussing charts in general and concepts of Jyotish for interpretation related to those charts. Now, a gentleman, an esteemed researcher himself, Pete Dawkins, has suggested that we look at the chart of Joe Biden, who many of you in the US will at least know that he's someone who has a former vice president under Barack Obama, and he has thrown his hat among the thousands of other Democrats into the race for the president's candidacy for the Democratic Party in the upcoming 2020 election. And so, of course, Iyer suggested that the D11 could be used to help judge the outcome of election in terms of whether an official was running a period and sub-period that would give him success that way. So I'm going to begin by just pulling up his chart. So, see, please someone confirm that you're seeing Joe Biden's chart on a Word document. Yes? Okay. Thank you. And one thing we should be aware of is that this birth time is an approximate birth time in the sense that it's given an A rating on astrodatabank.com because it is said to come from him directly, not from a birth record in hand. And of course, a time of 8:30 is very likely a rounded time. So we have to understand that the divisional charts and the lagnas of the divisional charts are not necessarily reliable. But because it would take some 40 minutes in order to change the lagna from Scorpio to Libra, we can probably feel very comfortable with the fact that the birth lagna is correct, right? And first of all, what is the most distinguished, or one of the most distinguishing features of this chart? One of the most distinguishing features of this chart.
The exalted Jupiter.
Well, is it merely exalted?
It's very close to the highest point of exaltation.
And is there anything else going on with it that we should make note of that makes it particularly strong?
Vargotama.
It's also Vargotama. So we have Jupiter at 2 degrees 4 minutes of Cancer, applying to its most extreme degree of exaltation, which would be 5, and it's also Vargotama. And then, in terms of yogas, what should we also note about this Jupiter?
Kesari Yoga.
There's Kesari Yoga, right? Because it's in an angle from the moon. Not Gajukesari Yoga, because Jupiter does not fall likewise in an angle from the birth lagna. And so it was actually in his Jupiter major period that Joe Biden became vice president of the United States under Barack Obama, starting in, the election was won in November 2008, and then, of course, he was sworn in as vice president in January 2009. Now, interestingly enough, this was in the Jupiter-Mercury period. Jupiter-Mercury period. So besides Kesari Yoga, based on, some article that I produced last year about some, type of connection between planets, what might be notable here about Jupiter and Jupiter-Mercury?
Kendra Sambanda.
Right. So, we have the moon and Mars here in our mutual glance, which, though Mars is not well placed by house, obviously the moon and Mars combining is a mutual glance between the first lord and the ninth lord, right? Having Raja Yoga giving qualities, right? And then, of course, if you incorporate this idea of Kendra Sambandha, which very much I adhere to, you've got a rather a Kendra relationship between Jupiter as the fifth lord and Mars again as the first lord. They're joined there by the 11th lord, right? But really see the idea, if you're applying, this concept of ire, that, election outcomes can be sometimes, I misspoke. I apologize. I misspoke. You run the election in Jupiter Saturn. Okay, you won the election in Jupiter Saturn. My apologies. But what I wanted to see here, what I wanted to show you here, is that obviously in his Dashamsha, we don't know if the Dashamsha Lagna is correct. The birth lagna is at 10 degrees, it's just 1 degree away from the borderline between the third and the fourth Dashamsha, but we see here that Jupiter is strongly placed, right? Saturn, if this lagna is correct, would also be strongly placed in the ninth house, and they're in a 4-10 relationship from each other. But what intrigued me about this timing is, if you remember, keep in mind it was Jupiter-Saturn, and applying the IR D11 here, what do you notice about Jupiter-Saturn?
They're in a Shankar Yoga, I believe that's the term for it, from the ascendant. Equidistant.
Well, they wouldn't be involved in a Shubha Sankhya Yoga because you've got one benefic and one malefic, all right? So they're involved in a Sankhya Yoga, but wouldn't be a pure Shubha Sankhya Yoga.
Mishra Sankhya.
Mishra Sankhya Yoga. So, but you've got Jupiter, presuming, well, first of all, they're connected. That's what I want people to see, right? They're in a mutual glance. And this is this idea that you've all heard me talk about. Then when you're running the period and subperiod of two planets strongly connected in a particular division, that period and subperiod can prove significant relative to the meanings of that division. And, let's presume that the Lagna is correct, in which case Jupiter would fall in a good angle house. And Saturn, the subperiod lord, when he became vice president, would be the Lagna of this chart, and it goes to the 10th, obviously, in its exaltation sign. Okay. So that's, looking at when he won the election in hindsight. Now, you'll notice here that I'm giving Karakas, Jaimini Karakas, and I also wanted to see this, again, as partly a way of verifying the birth lagna, because, if events come out in Charadasha, that's good testimony for the birth lagna, because the birth lagna is the starting point of Charadasha. And for those of you who know Jaimini, and most of you do, he won the election, or he became vice president, I should say, in the major period of Aquarius. Major period of Aquarius. What strikes you about that from the Jaimini point of view? Anyone?
AMK is 9 away from Aquarius.
So AMK falls in a good, remember it's the idea of falling in the 9th, the 10th, or the 11th. These placements of the AMK from a Dasha Lagna can be particularly good periods. Now, of course, you know, what else is going on with that AMK here? Besides,
AMK Sambandha.
Right, so you've got a connection with the AK, which forms a very significant Raja Yoga. But, you know, what else strikes you about the Aquarius period in terms of giving him a very high position?
The 10th house becomes very strong.
In what way?
Well, first you have the sun. You know, the sun in the 10th is one thing. And then you have the two strongest natural benefics, Jupiter and Venus. Venus is with the sun, and it's strong because it's in exchange. And then you have the exalted Jupiter aspecting it.
Right. Is there anything? For an excellent analysis, you touched on very, very good points, but I don't think I heard you hear one.
It's a Gemini
yoga, exchange between the 9th and 10th lords from Aquarius.
Exchange between the 9th and the 10th lords. Absolutely.
Mars Venus exchange.
No, absolutely. You know, some of you may remember our article, The Guru's Clue, where I was talking about that from a particular Dasha Lagna, it's really important to pay attention to exchanges. And an exchange that I said that it was really important to pay attention to is the 9-10 exchange, right? And 1-10 exchange. You know, these things that would then, indicate, a period of great rise. So there's a lot going on here. Now let's back up. First, the gentleman said, you've got the sun there, and you've all heard me when you took my Gemini courses, when you're running a period containing the sun or when the sun falls to the 10th, this can be a time when you really shine, right? And then the influence of the two best natural benefics, one of whom is extremely exalted. But, and you spoke fairly rapidly. I'm not sure if I caught the fact that someone see that there's the Venus-Moon combination going on here, right? The moon from Aries is in a mutual glance with Venus, right? So there's that Raja Yoga going on. So this rather satisfied me that I don't think the Lagna needed verification, but this really sort of supported that idea. And interestingly enough, the time when the election was being contested, that is the months leading up to when the election take place, he was running the sub-period of Scorpio. Right? Think about that. Now, when he actually was sworn into office, right, when he won the election, the sub-period was Sagittarius, from where that, of course, that AMK-AK combination would fall in the 11th from there, right? Would fall in the 11th there. For those who know Gemini, I would also point out that Scorpio, if you use it as a point of reference, you've got a very nice Shubha Sankhya Yoga that Jupiter forms, being in the 9th trine from there, and then no planets in the 5th trine from there, which would be Pisces. Of course, it aspects onto Scorpio as well. But of course, the question at present is, what does it look like when he runs, right? When he runs for presidency, coming up here in the 2020 election. I noted that it would be Jupiter Rahu in the Vimshottari system, the last sub-period within the Jupiter major period. What strikes you about Jupiter Rahu just from the basis of the Rashi?
Rahu will act like the sun.
And what would then be the significance of that, Nidima?
Then Jupiter, Sun are 5-9 relationship.
All right. What else?
Jupiter's the 10th lord in the first, giving Raja Yoga.
Right. Under the influence of two benefics, and of course, using Dasha Lagna, that Scorpio becomes the 5th house from there, though, right? With the sun giving that result. So now, does that mean he's going to win the election? Does that mean he's even going to, win the nomination? No, we can't say that for sure, right?
Can I add, Rahu will also act like Ketu, since he's in Magha, and Ketu is in the 4th house of throne.
Good, Nidima. So she's employing this. Of course, in terms of Udu's clue, Jupiter itself is in its own nakshatra, right? So we're back to the results that it gives in terms of the Kesari Yoga and so on and so forth. But then Rahu, I was in Ketu's nakshatra, falling in the 4th house. She relates that to the Simhamsa, seat of the power, right? The throne and so on. And then, but of course, you know, one of the reasons we're looking at this chart is we're looking at the potential D11 or D10 in connection with D11 for, you know, indicating periods when a person can really elevate. So in terms of the Dashamsha, you know, we saw earlier that, you know, Jupiter, the major period lord, is well placed. We're not sure exactly which house it might be placed in, right? Rahu here would be in Libra. If this was actual Lagna of D10, then it would be in that Lagna, right? Giving results of Venus, again, but we're not sure maybe which houses that's in. They're not in a particularly good positional relationship. And then, you know, in D4 here, I'm sorry, in D11, how would you think about Rahu in this chart? What would strike you?
It looks like Saturn in the Rashi of Saturn.
And therefore?
And Saturn is the Lagna Lord of D11 and the second Lord of games.
If this is the correct Lagna. In any way, it's giving the results of the exalted Saturn to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, it's also with Venus. Now, presuming that it's going to either be, well, I guess I'd have to look at that for sure, but, you know, if it's either Capricorn or if it's Aquarius, then, you know, if you're taking lordships in divisional charts, which of course Iyer did not do, but K and Rao did, right, then Venus obviously becomes a very good planet from here. But regardless of that, Rahu's with a natural benefic, right? It gets that influence either way. So it'll be interesting to see, right? It'll be, you know, interesting. I don't think I looked at what he was going to be running in Charadasha during that time, which would be important as well. But
I think one of the periods in Charadasha, Mark, is Leo.
Period? Major period?
I think it's the sub-period.
Okay.
I'm not entirely sure. I think it's Sagittarius Leo, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think Leo is one of them.
You know, this is coming back to, maybe I did look at, I think the major period is Sagittarius, in which case, you know, I like the combination of the AK and AMK in the 11th from there. But so, you know, time will tell. It's pretty early yet. Pretty early yet, but you know, he is now declared himself a candidate, and so you know, we'll see what happens. All right. So
Mark, would you give him a Hamsa Yoga in D1? Since Jupiter is in the Trikona, in the.
Well, if you go by what's given in Paladipika, which is the text you were taught from, right? Mm-hmm. Then the Mahaparusha yogas are considered both from in angles and also trines, right?
Yeah.
The more conservative, you might say more strict definition that is given in Parashar Horrors is that they would fall in angles. Regardless, of course, a natural benefic like Jupiter falling in an exaltation sign in an angle and trine, particularly when it's got good lordships as it does here, is a very favorable planet. And of course, it's already made him a vice president of the United States. So, you know, now it's more of a question: could it potentially make him president as well?
Certainly, Hamsa Yoga from the moon.
Sure.
Yes, definitely.
And of course, the case for yoga. But I'm telling you, what I find significant in this chart, in terms of understanding what has happened to him in his life as far as status, you see this Kendra Sambandha relationships between the moon, who's the 9th lord, Jupiter, who's the 5th lord, and Mars, who's the 1st lord, right? Which, of course, Mars, you know, not having a good house placement, but does having a source of strength because of the exchange with Venus, right? Okay, so moving on here. So this is not the chart of some celebrity individual. Far from it, actually. In fact, this person is a person who's had a very, very difficult life. Very difficult life. And you see the combination here that is really a very challenging, difficult combination, unfavorable combination in the chart.
So the Saturn Mars aspecting each other, and the malefic hemming of the Lagna and the planets in it.
Okay, well, we can start with normally that combination in the first house for Virgo could be a very good combination, could it not?
Yes.
Gives Saraswati yoga. Combination of Mercury and Venus for this ascendant is said to give the best Raja yoga, right? All benefics in the first house, Chandra yoga. You could go on here. But they all get quite spoiled by the malefic hemming, which more and more I'm seeing this is, what really spoils, houses and the lords in the house and yogas that they form. Malefic hemming does that to a very large degree. But, really that's not the most difficult feature of her chart. What might someone else identify? Now, Draven mentioned the Saturn-Mars mutual aspect, but who's really suffering the most from that?
The moon.
I think it's
The moon, right? The moon here is waxing, and it is a little more than half bright, but it's in its debilitation sign. It's an influence. It's with a Vargotum, a very strong Saturn, aspected by Mars. And, of course, Saturn and Mars are the two worst natural malefics, but for Virgo, when they both influence some graha, it's worse. Why? Why is it worse?
6 and 8
lords.
Right. They're the Mula Trikona, 6th Lord, and Mula Trikona, 8th Lord. So what do you think some of her difficulties in life have been? Actually, her major difficulty.
Sickness.
Well, what kind of sickness?
Depression.
Mental.
Mental depression.
So actually, this chart first came to my attention back in 1997 when I was involved with a woman who was a very renowned psychiatrist in the area. And this was one of her patients who was often suicidally depressed, right? Often suicidally distressed and struggled mightily with her mental health. I won't go into more details about that. But recently, I visited this woman, not this woman who started this, but my psychiatrist friend, and got some interesting update about something that's happened in this person's life, right? Which is that she, and again, this is a woman who's considered that nothing favorable, nothing fortunate has ever happened in her life, ever. That if you talk to her, that's what she would tell you, okay? But she won a lottery worth $850,000. Okay? She won nearly $1 million. And it's an interesting story. She was there was a gas station where she filled up her car, and this is where she would buy lottery tickets, right? And so, she would do this on occasion. And then one time she came in there, and the attendant said, we're still waiting to know about someone who won $850,000 in the lottery. I know you purchased lottery tickets. Have you ever checked your ticket? Right? And this was 2 months after the lottery had come out. So she actually went into her car, got her old tickets, and wouldn't you know, she had won.
Wow.
And she nearly fainted right on the floor. She fell down. And then there was a big newspaper story about it, and so on and so forth. Now, does anybody want to guess, just based on her birth chart, what period she won this in? And I'm telling you, based on the Rashi, it would not have been easy. But think about which house rules lotteries.
8th house.
8th house. So in what period might this have happened?
Mars moon.
Well, I was only looking for the major period, but you're right, Nilima. Okay, it was the major period of Mars, which the only way in which you might think this had any connection to her winning a lottery would be the fact that it's the 8th Lord. But is there any way it shows is there any perspective, you might say, any interpretive principle of Jyotish where it actually might show Dan Yoga? Because in my article, it could happen to you. I saw the way, I was showing the way in which, when a planet gives these results, it gives them not only because it's connected to the 8th house, but it has some potential for giving Dan Yoga.
5 and 11.
Draven, why don't you take this one? What were you going to say?
Yeah, Mars would give since it owns the eighth house, which is impressionable house, it would also give the result of the planets it is associated with, or is a sambandha with. Over here, it is Saturn. Saturn owns the fifth house, which is with Moon, which is the 11th house. So a 5-11 combination is a Dana Yoga.
So if you take Kendra Sambandha, all right, and the Moon Saturn, it's terrible for her mental health, but it is a combination of the 11th Lord with the 5th Lord, right? Disposited by Mars, and then a Kendra Sambandha from Mars. So that's one idea, just based on the Rashi, right? Is there any other idea based on the Rashi that Mars could potentially show some potential this way?
So is it some sort of Viparita Raja Yoga, where the 8th and 12th Lord aspected by a malefic Saturn?
Well, here's the other idea, right? But the Viparit Raja Yoga won't necessarily make you wealthy. It might elevate you, right? But I would agree. This gives, if you look in the classics in Paladipika, the 8th Lord in the 12th, with the additional influence of natural malefics, gives something called Sarala Yoga, which is one of the Viparit Raja Yogas. Okay, very good identification on your part, Vijay. One additional idea here. Think of my article, The Kaleidoscope of Time. If you remember the subtitle of that article, which I'd be amazed if you do, it gives you a clue. Dasha Lagna.
Dasha Lagna, yeah.
What happens to this combination from Dasha Lagna?
3 benefits.
1-9.
So 1-9.
Mars becomes the 9th Lord of Bhagya in the Lagna with the 1st Lord Sun. Any source of strength for the Sun here that people see?
Yeah, Bhagautama.
Okay, it's Vargotama. But again, you saw that one of the ways in which I was testing the Iyer D11, because he talks about it being predictive of easy money, which is what lotteries would be to see Mars in the D11. And I know the birth time to be quite accurate, and I have no question about the lagnas of these divisional charts. So if I show you the Iyer D11 here, what do you notice about Mars?
1-5 Raja Yoga, aspected by Jupiter from the 9th.
Well, first of all, you'll remember it was in Leo in the birth chart. So
yeah, Bhagautama again.
Change with someone, what do you want?
And someone is noticing here that it's in an exchange between with the sign lord, the Sun, giving it another source of strength. Right? Now, again, Iyer didn't take house lordships. K and Rao did. If we take house lordship, who is the exchange between? From here, what the Sun Mars exchange is exchange between what?
5 and 8.
5 and 8. Think about that. 5th house, rules gambling, which is what a lottery is, and the 8th house obviously rules lotteries overtly. Now, Peter mentioned that Mars gets additionally favorably qualified here by getting the aspect of a Swakshetra Jupiter. You get a virtual chocolate if you tell me which sub-period this happened in. Which sub-period this happened in?
Sun.
Major period. Sun's a good answer, but it's not the correct answer in this case. Jupiter. And so, I would say that D11 performed pretty well here, right?
Yeah.
In terms of being predictive, or at least supportive of predictive, of her winning nearly, $1 million in the Mars-Jupiter period. And then, I'd met this woman. I kind of knew her life history, obviously, and I was really, really happy for her because she has suffered terribly in her life and not had a very fortunate existence at all. And this was one of obviously a major fortunate thing that did happen to her. And it was important to happen to her too, because she had been really struggling in recent history to support it, to hold a job. And, financially, things were getting very bleak, and she was contemplating having to sell her house. just prior to having won this. So, good for her. She experienced some good fortune. It was a very interesting case to test the D11, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Mark, who's the yogi? Is Saturn the yogi here?
No,
prosperity. I'm just looking.
It was the yogi and aviyoga, or the yogi and duplicate yoga did not come into play here.
Okay.
As far as periods when she got this, right? Because I did look for that. I forget exactly, but
I get Saturn.
And that could be. Which Saturn isn't part of a Dan Yoga combination in the Rashi that is Kendra Sambandha from this Saturn, right? We talked about that. One thing, again, for you Jaimini scholars, I was interested to see, because in my article, It Could Happen to You, which was about the charts of lottery winners that you've all seen, I was showing, the timing of that, both from the planetary system point of view and also the sign system point of view, Jaimini. This happened in her Taurus major period. And then I'll talk about the sub-period in a moment, but Taurus major period, how could really significant financial gains be indicated by the Taurus period from a Jaimini point of view?
Trikona, benefic Raja Yoga, Shubha Trikona with nothing in the ninth. All benefics in the fifth, nothing in the ninth.
Well, first of all, it's the ninth house of Bhagya, right? Ninth house of Bhagya. And good for you, Nilima, that you're seeing the Argala formation to that ninth house Taurus, with all the benefics in the fifth from there, with no planets in the ninth from there, which would be Capricorn, right? So that contributed. I wouldn't say that I would have predicted it based on that, but that certainly contributed to it. What else? Use it as a lagna.
The 11th house gets the aspect of all three benefics.
As does the second.
As does the second.
And the benefics that rule those houses. Jupiter's aspecting onto its own 11th house from Taurus, and Mercury is aspecting onto its own second house from Taurus, again, using Rashi Drishti. And so those of you who took Jaimini level 2 talked about how houses become so strong when they get the mutual or the dual influence of both Jupiter and Mercury, right? And then add to the fact that it's their house lords, add to the fact that it's the 11th house from there, and the second house from there, Pisces and Gemini, then you see how this major period could have brought an experience like that. Now, an additional virtual chocolate can come to anyone who, and if you don't want chocolates, I'll give you nuts or something, all right? If you could identify the sub-period when this happened within the Taurus major period. And I'll give you a clue. It involves those three benefics falling in Virgo.
Taurus, Pisces.
Scorpio.
Who said Scorpio? Georgie.
Yep.
Why?
Because they go into the 11th house.
That is brilliant. Very good. Very good. That's exactly right. Excellent. Okay. So, very interesting case from that standpoint. Now, people in the U.S. at least should probably recognize this name, at least of my generation, although probably most of you are not of my generation.
I am.
Hey, tell us who this is.
Reynolds.
Well, I mean, who is he?
Well, he was a major film star.
Actor.
Right. So actor. Hollywood movie star, right? Prominent Hollywood movie star. And now here's for bonus points, Pete. Do you remember the movie in the early 70s for which was sort of a breakout role for him that kind of launched stardom, even though he had appeared in films before? You have any idea? Disturbing film. Deliverance.
Yeah, it's not the one I was thinking of, actually. But yeah, Deliverance.
Deliverance, 1972. Now, he became a film star in his Jupiter Mahadasha. Under what principle of Jyotish could it be seen that he would be performing and acting in his Jupiter major period? Do you see any?
Jupiter is BK is third.
Well, if he was running the Scorpio period in Charadasha, I would say yes to that, Nilima. But we're mixing systems there. We're
I am. Sorry, yeah. I haven't done Jyotish for a long time.
You're excused. You're excused. Yeah. And so, any other ideas about how Jupiter would show him being involved in so strongly in performing and acting?
Well, it's in the third house from the moon.
That's it. That's it. But would you, just based on the Rashi, have predicted stardom in his Jupiter major period? Is there any principle that even hints at that?
Jupiter
No, by the way, he continued to be a major star in his Saturn period, which is much more obvious, is it not?
Yeah.
Saturn's the Yogakaraka planet, 9th and 10th Lord, strongly placed in the 10th house and its Mula Trikona sign. That's clear. But,
The 10th Lord goes to the third house.
Excuse me?
Sun, which is the 10th Lord from Jupiter, goes to the third house of performing arts.
Good. Now, very good. Now, for applying Dasha Lagna, right? The fact that he could be acting during the Jupiter major period, she's pointing out that the 10th Lord from there becomes the Sun. It goes to the third house from there, along with Mercury. Now, I will now add the additional information, but is there any other idea about how Jupiter as a major period, again, relating to an article I published last year, how Jupiter can give any quality of Raja Yoga? Because it's certain.
I'm sorry. Jupiter, 11th Lord of Arts, gains, creativity, and it goes in Aquarius in D9. So which is gets us.
We're getting to D9 in a moment, but you're jumping ahead, Nirima. Okay, we're going to get to D9 because part of the answer is in D9. Actually, a big answer as to why Jupiter gave the results as it did is in the divisional charts, which is why I've specifically selected this chart. But apply Udu's clue. Apply Udu's clue. What do you see here? If you remember what Udu's clue is.
Nakshatra.
So whose nakshatra is Jupiter in?
Mercury.
And does Mercury give any quality of Raja Yoga?
4-5 with the Sun in the 9th house.
Right. And I mentioned that he had this breakout role in 1972 in this moving deliverance that kind of catapulted him to true sort of Hollywood A-lister type stardom. And does anybody want to guess in what sub-period that happened in keeping with Udu's clue?
It's got to be Mercury, I think.
Jupiter, Mercury.
Correct. Correct. Now, in terms of why, again, adding additional color as to why Jupiter could have been so favorable for him, what do you notice here in Navamsha?
It's in Aquarius in the 10th.
11th Lord.
Well, it's involved in a Gajikesari yoga, right? With Jupiter in the 11th, in Aquarius, where it's going to have strength anyway, almost like an exalted planet, but you'll see that it's also in an exchange with its sign Lord Saturn. And remember, it was in Jupiter Saturn, it was in Jupiter major period, Saturn major period where he had his stardom. Right? And then, additionally, if you want to see Jupiter in Dashamsha, what do you know? Swakshetra in the 11th. Right?
Mishra Sankhya.
Mishra Sankhya. And then
throwing an aspect onto Saturn, the 10th Lord, in the 3rd house of performance.
Right. But now he got very wealthy as a result, as always, when you become a star, you typically do, right? And so this is one of the charts I wanted to look at with regards to, does D11 indicate, really significant financial gains in the Jupiter Mahadasha, right? And by the way, I mentioned to you before we get to the D11, looking at D10 here, it was Jupiter Mercury that proved a very significant turning point in his career life. What strikes you here about Jupiter Mercury?
Mercury goes to the 10th house from Dasha Lagna, Jupiter.
Yes, remember this idea? in D11 when a planet falls 10th from the, as an Antardasha Lord from the Dasha Lagna, the special significance of that if they hold a promise in the birth chart. And of course, Jupiter's in its own sign and Mercury is in Jupiter's sign. So there's a dispositor sambandha relationship as well. Do you see?
Mm-hmm.
Which I also talk about in my Secrets of the Dashamsha book. Very predictable then this way. But now, see D11. Jupiter.
Beautiful. Exalted alone in a positive house.
Well, and then Miss Sankhya Yoga, what do you see?
Jupiter, Mercury.
Jupiter, Mercury. So you have two benefics, one of whom is in its exaltation sign, one of whom is Vargotama relative to the birth chart, right? And so when you have a real successful film that's very successful and you got to get a lot of accolades for it, what happens to an actor or an actress?
He gets rich.
Their next asking price per picture goes up considerably. Their agent negotiates for them quite a better contract than maybe they've ever experienced previously, because now, they've proven themselves to be more of a star. So this is exactly what happened to him. Well, the whole Jupiter period is when he became, quite wealthy, but then Jupiter, Mercury in particular, related to his very successful performance in a very notable film during that time, really added to that. Right? Okay. Questions, thoughts here before we go on?
211 Tana Yoga here, Jupiter, Mercury.
Yes, okay.
511.
511.
So, George Clooney, whose chart I'm showing here, has made millions from being an actor, but some of you may be aware he and this other individual started this brand of tequila, right? And this was in his Saturn major period. He started this brand of tequila, and recently some international, liquor concern bought it, and his initial payout from it was something like 300 million, with potentially another half a billion. Enormously wealthy, enormous flow of wealth into his life in first the Jupiter period from his acting stardom, and then the Saturn period, right? Now, here I'm showing a screen that's going to give you the yogi points, going to give you the yogi, and going to give the duplicate yogi. What is relevant in terms of what I just talked about?
Exalted Sun and exalted Venus, yogi and duplicate yogi.
Yogi and the duplicate yogi are a exalted Venus. Now the Sun is not quite as exalted as it might seem. Why?
It's past.
Well, think about where it goes. Whereas it goes in Navamsha at 22 degrees.
Debilitated.
Going to build in. I believe it gets cancellation there, but still. But nonetheless, in the Rashi, is yogi is the Sun in its exaltation sign, and certainly the duplicate yogi, Venus, is quite exalted without any qualification that way, without any thing that sort of counterindicates it. But what intrigued me in looking at his chart is the great wealth that flowed into his life in the Jupiter major period and the Saturn major period, which again, just from the birth lagna and their placement and conditions there, might not be your first thought about what these periods would bring. Now, I've written extensively about his chart and explained, different things about it that way, but just take it on the. Now, I realize I'm not showing here the North Indian style D11, and I should be, and I apologize for that, but hopefully you'll be able to make out that Jupiter is in its own sign, right? Is strong in D11. This is the period that when he first, or one of the periods when he got pretty wealthy. And then Saturn, of course, the period when he's gotten, you might say, super wealthy, is falling in its Mula Trikona sign. Now, his birth time does come from written record. You know, whether it gives an absolutely correct D11 Lagna is always a bit of a question. But my point is that, you know, two periods that have brought great wealth in his life are both extremely well dignified in D11, right? Okay. Now, everyone should recognize the name Barbra Streisand. And she, in her Venus major period, won just about every award the entertainment industry had to offer. The very first movie she appeared in, she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, Funny Girl. It was 1969. Of course, she was a major recording artist during that time, winning Grammy Awards. She also, I believe, appeared on stage and won an Emmy Award, and so on and so forth. All right. So again, D11 is something that IR indicates we should be able to utilize to predict a period when a person is getting a lot of honors and awards, which are, of course, non-monetary gains. But then, of course, she was also getting extremely wealthy. How, just based on the Rashi, could you know, great success in her Venus Mahadasha be predicted? Now, I've written about this chart, some of you may remember, but you know, just looking at it now, how could Venus give that kind of results? First of all, does Venus have any source of strength?
Yeah, it becomes fine, you know.
Just based on the Rashi, does it have any source of strength?
Exchange with Saturn.
Exchange between Venus and Saturn.
The exchange, the Parivartana Yoga gives it a source of strength. Now, Nilima mentions it's good, you know, own sign placement in Navamsha. You'll see that it goes in its own sign in Navamsha, and its own sign in Dashamsha, in its exaltation sign in D60, and many, and I think in the Drekana. All those Rashis, all those divisions that contribute the most to Vimshapakabala strength. Her Venus is remarkably strongly placed in all of them, which is one of the reasons it gave such powerful results. But how does it give Raja Yoga?
Third house becomes very strong from Venus.
Well, good. You're applying Dasha Lagna. Third house becomes very strong within. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because it was in Venus Sun that she won the Oscar for her performance in the movie Funny Girl, with Sun obviously in the third house in there, extremely exalted. You'll see that it's only 30 minutes from its highest point of exaltation. But going back to the major period lord, how does Venus here give Raja Yoga? I recognized this from a case that I'd seen of K. N. Rao's that he wrote about in his book, Ups and Downs in Career, where it's the chart of a politician born on the same day as Barbra Streisand, you know, with Pisces Lagna. So the patterning is somewhat identical, and Sri Rao had predicted the rise of this politician in her Venus period based on the principles that this gives Raja Yoga. Does anyone see it?
1-4 exchange from Venus Mahadasha.
Well, obviously from Dasha Lagna, the exchange becomes very powerful. It becomes 1-4, right? And what kind of planet does Venus become if you use Aquarius as a Lagna, Dasha Lagna?
Yoga Karaka.
Yoga Karaka.
Becomes Yoga Karaka.
4th
right?
and 9th law, yes.
But there's a principle from the birth Lagna here, that it's predictable that Venus could produce Raja Yoga, the effects of Raja Yoga, the results arising.
Would you say Venus and Mercury from Shubha Sankhya Yoga for the Lagna?
Well, you're asking me, is there Shubha Katara Yoga here?
Shubha
right?
Katara.
And yes, there is. And now it's not pure, because, you know, more than just Mercury and Venus as natural benefics are hemming the ascendant. But is it good for the ascendant? And is it Katara Yoga? Does it contribute to what can happen in the Venus period? Absolutely. Vijay, if you're still with us.
Yeah. Yes. 8th Lord and 12th.
Thank you. Thank you. It's Sarala Yoga again, right? It's the 8th Lord in the 12th, with the additional influence of malefics, obviously. And, you know, these yogas can give surprise, and that's why they're listed in Paladipika as being capable of giving good results. And it was on this, in Sri Rao, in his case study in Ups and Downs in Careers, it mentioned specifically that this Venus gives Viparit Raja Yoga. there's more to it than that, you know. It's Dasha Lagna, what happens from that, and then how powerful, you know, and how strongly and well placed Venus is in all these divisional charts. But that is the reason. Now, again, I'm only showing the South Indian style of the D11 here. But for those of you who can't read it, Venus is very strongly placed in the strongest angle house in this chart. And Venus is very strongly placed in the sun's sign. In the sun's sign. Now, remember when I told you she won her Oscar for best actress for Funny Girl? It was in Venus Sun. It was in Venus Sun.
Mark, I also noticed that, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
From Dasha Lagna, there's a really nice Kendra Sambandha with Jupiter, which is the 11th Lord from Dasha Lagna.
Absolutely.
Fourth house.
You know, in order to understand some of the ramifications of what did and could happen to her in her Venus period, Dasha Lagna has a story to tell that way. It most definitely has a story to tell that way. Okay. So, anyone want to guess how many Grammy Awards Aretha Franklin, who recently passed, won? Anybody have any? Just take a wild guess. Anyone?
10.
Keep going.
20. I don't know. I'm not sure.
That's better. No, that's better. 18.
Oh, okay.
You get a chocolate for that.
and she was nominated 44 times.
Wow.
There was a period starting in 1967. Well, she won one every year, starting for a period running, 5 or 6 years. So if you look over at the Vimshotri Dasha in the lower left corner of the screen, you can see that these Grammy Award-winning things started happening in her Saturn major period, followed by her Mercury major period. Right? And of course, as a result of her winning these, she's being a very successful artist, selling millions of records and therefore becoming very wealthy. Please note that Mercury is her duplicate yogi, right? And it is the ninth lord in the fifth. It's the ninth lord in the fifth. What kind of yoga does that give?
Raja Yoga. And Dana Yoga.
Dana Yoga.
Dana Yoga. From the moon, it's the first lord in the ninth. Right? So this is what I was highlighting in the Proper Points of Prosperity article, that I want to make clear again that a planet simply being either the yogi or the duplicate yogi, in my experience alone, is not going to make that period good financially. Right? But it can really contribute to it, especially if that lord or that planet, that graha, who is either the yogi or the duplicate yogi, shows the potential of giving that good financial prosperity in additional ways, which of course this Mercury certainly does, as it's giving in Dana Yoga both from the Rashi, from the Lagna and from the moon. Now again, I'm showing the D11 only in the South Indian style, but you should be able to make out what sign Mercury is in there, right? And where it's placed.
Exactly.
It's in its exaltation sign in the second house. Saturn, the period that gave her initial success and therefore good prosperity, is falling in a ninth house, right? Good ninth house. Now it's in Aries, which of course is in its debilitation sign. But for those who can read the South Indian style chart, what else is going on here that you'd want to make note of this way?
It gets the debilitation cancelled by the aspect of Mars, its lord.
Its sign lord is in a mutual glance with it, giving effective cancellation, and since it's falling in the ninth, this is Nicha Bhanga Raja Yoga. And remember what Irish principle was about planets that have Nicha Bhanga in a divisional chart falling in a good house. He's indicating that they give their results very strongly and favorably, which is what, relative to gains, D11, Saturn did for her. Now, of course, it raised her up in you know, in general, gave her Raja Yoga as well. What you see with regards to the Rashi this way?
There's an exchange, Saturn-Venus exchange.
Well, making both planets strong, but you know, well, that's significant, particularly if you consider Dasha Lagna, right? Because now it becomes a 1-9 exchange. But how does Saturn just give Raja Yoga from the birth Lagna?
It's a Yoga Karaka.
It's the Yoga Karaka planet, right? And why is she performing at this time? Who's Saturn with?
Jupiter, third lord.
Jupiter, right. All right. So 18 Grammy Awards and 44 nominations.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Now, this chart was provided to me by someone who's in this program, and actually someone who is with us today. His name shall remain anonymous, right? And he wrote to me after he had read the article, Proper Points of Posterity, and I will read to you what he wrote. He said, just read your article you sent and quickly went through my chart. The fourth interpretive principle is in play. You can use my chart as an example also. I am financially independent and ordinarily affluent. I had that section in the article about people that were, you know, financially independent, prosperous, but in what I would call an ordinary way, not an extraordinary way, like a lot of the charts I was using. And he's pointing out here that his yogi planet is Venus and his duplicate yogi is Jupiter. So what do we notice about these planets in his birth chart?
Kendra Sambandha, both very strong. Jupiter double first year strength. Jupiter
exalted, Venus in its Mula sign. And, you know, the fourth principle that was given in that article is when there's a sambandha, there's a connection between the yogi and the duplicate yogi, which then forms a very prosperity-giving combination. Now, I don't think I gave any examples where I'm showing the connection through Kendra Sambandha, but these planets become not just Kendra Sambandha. When look at the degrees, Jupiter's at 15, Venus is at 14, they could hardly be more Kendra Sambandha. But what do they also become based on that article, Intimate Connections, that some of you have studied with me? What do they also become?
Mutual co-workers.
Mutual co-workers. That idea when planets are not just in angles from each other, but also have really good dignities, they become mutual co-workers. Of course, Jupiter is in the second, okay, which is, of course, a monetary related house. Venus is in the fifth lord in the fifth house, Lakshmi Sthana. And you'll see as additional comments here, interestingly, I have been building wealth through finance, investing, stock market, which of course is second house, fifth house, right? Connections there, right? And then he's making some comment from the Gemini angle that I won't go into as well. Now, just like anyone, when I come across some interpretive concept, some new principle of how to gain some, information about your birth chart or a birth chart, what do you immediately do?
Look at your own.
You look at your own chart, right? Naturally. So when I, first of all, came across the idea of the D11, I wanted to apply it to my own chart. And I came across this principle first in the Jupiter Mahadasha. And then predictively, I was wanting to see the prospect in the following major period of Saturn, right? So one thing we have to understand is that, first of all, Jupiter is my duplicate yogi, right? Jupiter is my duplicate yogi. And then, of course, the question becomes, do either of these planets show any potential for giving affluence just based on the birth chart? Do they have any qualifications that way, and how good are the qualifications, and so on and so forth? And so just based on the Rashi, what would you have to say about that? Please make a prediction for me.
Jupiter and Saturn aspect each other, so they are forming a Raj Yoga. But I'm not sure about Dhan Yogas here, but
Okay.
Raj Yoga is definitely there.
Okay, so Jupiter is showing more quality of Raja Yoga than Dhan Yoga, right? And Jupiter gave some quality of Raja. It's not the best Raja Yoga. In fact, it's a very inferior Raja Yoga because the Saturn also rules the 6th house. But, you know, they are an angle trine combination. Jupiter's in its own sign. Does Saturn have any source of strength there? Anybody see a source of strength for Saturn? Look at its degrees.
Flying D9, 11th in
Right.
Aquarius.
So it goes into Aquarius, so it does have an underlying source of strength. So, you know, Jupiter shows some potential for giving Raja Yoga, but not really much potential for giving Dhan Yoga here, except in one way. And here, again, I would ask you to apply Udu's clue.
Nakshatra of Saturn.
Now, consider Saturn. Does Saturn have any Dhan Yoga giving potentials?
The 5th Lord in the Lagna.
Yeah, 5th Lord in the Lagna. And if you apply another principle, again, based on an article that was published last year, might it potentially have some other Dhan Yoga giving qualifications based on a sambandha?
Four, 5, Raja Yoga. 5, 9, 5, 7, Raja Yoga.
Well, we already spoke about that. I'm talking about Dhan Yoga. That's
Dhan
Raja.
Yoga.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead, Dina.
I would say it's from Saturn is placed second from Moon, from Chandra Lagna.
Okay, but you know it's placed there as the 6th and the 7th Lord.
That's true.
The Venus and Saturn, Trikona Sambandha.
So see that Saturn at 3 degrees. Venus is a good monetary planet for this Lagna, obviously. It rules both the 2nd and the 9th, and in this case, Venus is the 9th Lord in the 9th. And there is this trine relationship, Trikona Sambandha, between Saturn and Venus. Now remember, I'm looking at this back in my Jupiter Mahadasha, right? And I'm aware that what's already passed is, actually when I was looking at this, I was running the Jupiter-Saturn period. When I first was considering my chart in relationship to the D11, I was looking at the Jupiter-Saturn period, and it had given me Raja Yoga. I was made a vice president in the San Diego office of an international consulting firm and started making the highest salary I'd had in my life to date. In other words, it had been both beneficial in terms of raising me up professionally and the accompanying compensation that went with it, which is actually predictable just based on the birth chart, right? But then see D11, as I did.
Exchange Saturn Jupiter, 1, 2.
What do you notice? Jupiter's in Aquarius, in the Lagna, as this, and if you take house lordship, as the 2nd and 11th lords in the Lagna, in exchange with Saturn. So that was impressive to me in terms of how D11, you know, sort of timed this. And, you know, the Jupiter period in general, I was reasonably, you know, it's not anything out of the ordinary, but I was reasonably prosperous. And Jupiter-Saturn, you know, highlighted a particular, a good period in particular that way. But then I was interested to think about the upcoming Saturn major period, right? Because actually Saturn shows a better potential to bring Dhan Yoga than Jupiter. But here it was. And then I was looking at a particular sub-period that, you know, there's a particular reason that we already talked about. What sub-period would I be looking at in particular within the Saturn major period? What did we see that Saturn was involved in a Dhan Yoga with Venus? Right. And what do you notice here?
Chandra Sambandha, Venus in the 11th.
It's Yoga Karaka in the 11th.
Well, just take it as being in the 11th if you don't want to get involved in house lordships, right? So I wondered, or I speculated, I predicted to myself, you might say, you know, that if these principles were valid, then if the Trikona Sambandha was valid, and if, you know, placements in D11 were valid, then Saturn Venus should be prove especially good financially. And without going into details, it has. Even to the point that I received, major sums in just donations of people just giving me money to support my work with Jyotish, which again is what D11 is supposed to predict, right? Easy money that just comes to you, not necessarily because you've earned it, right? So this caught my eye. And I said, okay, I better start evaluating D11. Maybe it's a division, even though it's a non-Parashari division. And this is what started my research that I took a long time to come out with. But now I've published that article, which I'm not even done adding to yet, the 11th part of Gains in Glory. But one set of individuals that I did not show in that article yet that would apply is that, remember that D11, according to Iris, should be able to be utilized to predict non-monetary gains as well, which are, again, honors and awards, right? And I was showing this with regards to athletes. I was showing this in regards to Academy Awards winners. We've seen it here with regards to Grammy winners like Aretha Franklin and Barbra Streisand, but I was also showing it with regards to Nobel Prize winners. And I started with, well, wait a second, I got to get this new thing up here. Someone please indicate that you're, in a moment, seeing the chart of the British Nobel laureate poet, T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, one thing I've made note of, and I think I've commented on in my articles, first of all, even recorded birth times from a hospital record, in my experience and in K. and Rao's experience, he talks about this, can be anywhere from 5 to even up to 20 minutes off, right? So you always have to remember that, and it's a real bane of our existence as astrologers, because then, it always creates this question mark about whether the lagnas of the divisional charts are good, based even on a recording birth time. And so it's useful to know the dividing lines between certain divisions, right? So in this case, you can see that the lagna is 3 degrees 22 minutes based on a birth time of 7:45, which I suspect is a rounded birth time, particularly since this comes from the 19th century. And a dividing line between the first and second divisions of D11 is 243. So we have to understand that, if you just back up the birth time just a little bit, then it's going to be the first, not the second, And so keeping that in mind, but he won his Nobel Prize in his major period of Saturn and the sub-period of Jupiter. So how does this elevate him to the status of a Nobel Prize winner just based on the Rashi? What indicates that?
Yoga Karaka intense.
So, Saturn is the Yoga Karaka in the 10th. That's the major period that's giving him this. And what adds to that? Is Saturn merely just the Yoga Karaka in the 10th, or does something, additionally add to that relative?
Yoga Karaka from
Nodal Raja Yoga, 11th Lord with Rahu.
First of all, Vijay, did you say Yoga Karaka also from the moon?
Yes.
Everyone see this? This is a very strong Chandra Lagna. Strong, number one, because it's a bright moon still, waxing, but still quite bright. And it's in its exaltation sign. And notice that Saturn's also the Yoga Karaka from the moon in the 3rd house. Right? He wrote poetry. Didn't write novels. He didn't, he wrote poetry. So, and then, he got it in a certain subperiod. Does Saturn have any additional good qualification? What helps additionally qualify Saturn?
Saturn goes to Aquarius in the Navamsha.
So it's strongly placed in the Navamsha, has strength, right? I'm not showing Navamsha here, but it would be in the, wait a second. It's in the 8th, right? 8th Navamsha. So it goes into Aquarius. Good comment, then Draven. Has strength, underlying strength to give its results strongly. But did you remember what subperiod he got the Nobel Prize in within the Saturn major period?
Jupiter.
It was Jupiter. And who aspects Saturn?
Jupiter.
Jupiter. Right. So that's the Rashi. And if you see these planets in the D10, presuming D10 is correct, of course, Saturn's in the Lagna. You've all heard me talk about the special significance of Saturn in the Lagna. Right? Don't know if this D10 is correct, but in D11 would not show this event at all, right? With Saturn in the 6th and Jupiter, or Saturn, the major period lord in the 6th, Jupiter in the 11th, okay. But now, if you make it Aries, again, just a minute or so, if you back up the birth time, if you make it Aries, what happens now with Saturn and Jupiter? You make it Aries.
5th house, 10th house, they're both in good houses from the Lagna.
And Jupiter's in Saturn's sign. Now, again, if you've read my book, Secrets of the Shamsha, I was talking over and over again about when there's that, even this Sambandha by dispositorship, when the subperiod lord is in the sign of the major period lord, that period and subperiod is one to watch as bringing significant developments, which is what we have here. And if it becomes Aries, then Saturn goes to the good 5th as the 10th lord, if you're using lordships, and then Jupiter goes to the 10th, right? So just like all divisional charts, if you trust that a divisional chart is valid for use, it can also be used to rectify birth times. When you know that certain events happened at certain times and they should show up in a certain way. Now, you're always making a judgment that way, and there's no way of absolutely knowing for sure, but based on my investigations of D11, I would be, I'm of a strong opinion that Aries, not Pisces, is the correct attendant Lagna, in which case the birth time needs to be adjusted just a minute or 2 minutes backwards. Some may recognize, I'm using the charts of Nobel Prize winners in literature because I was a literature major, so I started looking at those first. They were of interest to me because I read the works for which these folks are famous. I read Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain in my 19th century literature course in college. He was a German novelist and won the Nobel Prize in literature in Venus Sun, or it might have been Venus Moon. I was difficult to get the right date, but it's probably Venus Sun, and certainly in the major period of Venus. And how does rise in status be indicated here in his birth chart? Just Venus, based on just Venus.
10th Lord in the 9th.
10th Lord in the 9th, Raja Yoga by placement. And then the Sun?
Lagna Lord in the 10th, directional strength.
Giving directional strength. So this period and sub-period, giving him a higher status, or this kind of status of being a Nobel Prize winner, is not difficult to see just based on the Rashi. What do we notice about Venus Sun here? Presuming again that this is a correct D10 Lagna, which I suspect it actually might be Sagittarius, but even so, right? Venus has a decent placement here, and of course the Sun is Swakshetra. It could be the 10th Lord in the 10th, or it could be the 9th Lord in the 9th. Right? I'm sorry, that's the Shamsha. I'm looking at the Shamsha. Here they're together. That's why I wanted to show this example. Here they're together, but they fall in the 8th house, which I really don't think they do. I think again that it doesn't take much adjustment in minutes in the birth time in order to put these not in the 8th house, but put them in the either the 7th house or the 9th house, right? Depending on whether it's Sagittarius or Aquarius. So I'm showing these examples purposely because through my researches with D11, I became convinced that it was a valid tool right? That it did show and support the kind of events that Iyer says that it does. And that's what I was trying to show you in that article with so many charts, right? And based on that, then it's now a chart that I utilize, like all the divisional charts, to help rectify birth times if I feel that they need it, right?
Would you say this Venus-Jupiter forming or Venus-Moon forming a Shubha Sankhya Yoga?
Well, this is one way, but remember it was, yes, this was one way in which if Capricorn is the true Lagna, that Venus gets redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was showing that,
Okay.
And even the sun gets redeemed here, right?
It does.
Right? Because, both Venus is formed, Shubha Sankhya Yoga is when planets are in houses benefics are in houses equidistant from a particular divisional Lagna, right? And even if they're 6-8, this forms what's called a Shubha Sankhya Yoga involving benefics. And then it's actually a good yoga that such a planet can give that a good result, even if it's in the 6th or if it's in the 8th. And actually now I'm reminding me, this is why I wanted to look at this example. Now the major period was Venus, which if Capricorn is the correct Lagna here, then Venus is involved in a Shubha Sankhya Yoga. But then a special one is formed by the sun and the moon, even though they're not necessarily classified as natural malefics, but they also form such a favorable yoga when they're in a 6-8 relationship from each other, as they are here. And it was either in the major period of the sun, the sub-period of the sun or the sub-period of the moon within Venus that he won the Nobel Prize. So, interesting to consider from that standpoint. And thank you, Neelima, for bringing that up. Now, the Indian Rabindranath Tagore, the first non-Caucasian individual to win the prize for literature, I am completely confident that his birth time is quite accurate, right? And he won his Nobel Prize in the major period of the moon and the sub-period of Venus. So, it's pretty obvious why the moon can be such a favorable period for him in terms of his status. What do you see here?
Maharaja Yoga?
Maharaj Yoga. He became the Maharaj of literature in his moon major period. And Venus is a sub-period. What do we understand here about Venus as far as some of the yogas that it's involved in? One yoga in particular that relates to artistic self-expression.
Saraswati Yoga.
It's part of a actually rather brilliant Saraswati Yoga. Can anybody place Venus in Navamsha?
Sva.
Can anybody place Mercury in Navamsha?
Sva.
Yes. And of course, Jupiter here is in its exaltation sign in the birth chart and involved in an exchange. So you see that all the components, and of course, because the moon's in the Lagna, the pattern is repeating from the Chandra Lagna and he was prolific in a variety of different art forms. It wasn't just in a variety of different forms of literature. But Moon Venus, he gets the Nobel Prize, and if we see these planets in the or see the moon in particular, the major period, when he wins the Nobel Prize, what, based on Irish principles, is good about this moon?
It's in a good house.
It's in an angle house, and then does it have any source of strength of which you're aware?
Digbala.
Digbala, right? Digbala. I look at dispositorship too when I look at these things, and it's disposited by Mercury, who's the Lagna of this D11, who goes into the 9th.
And now this Venus is combust. It doesn't go.
Well, you see, yeah, no, that's. I'm glad you brought that up, Neelima, and because if you read, in my article, the 11th part of Glory, the first part of it, I used like 50 pages to go through all 37 principles that Iyer gives in his book, second part of New Techniques and Predictions for Interpreting Divisional Charts. And I come to one where he talks about that if a planet is combust in the birth chart, then it is incapable of giving good results in any of the divisional charts. And my comment on that particular principle is that I've just not found that to be true, right? Particularly if the Venus has some, what I would, call compensation. Some of you read my article, The Icarus Factor, about, highly, highly combust planets that gave very strong results in terms of the yogas that they were involved in. So I believe Ira was too dogmatic in that principle. No question, if a planet is truly combust, its ability to be potent, giving its results, is affected, right? But if you apply that principle blindly, in my experience, you'll go wrong. And I
but the Cassini principle, it's close, but not quite close with the degrees here.
Well, I mean, right. But you see, where's the compensation? Yes, yes. That's exactly right. So this is what I mean when if you apply principles blindly and dogmatically, because for every principle there's an exception and there's something that modifies that. And this is why in Parashara Hor it says that the skill of a Jyotishi is in weighing up different factors and then making a judgment based on weighing up those different factors. If you just then make a judgment based on a single factor, Venus is highly combust here. It can't give the results of Saraswati Yoga, therefore, or it can't give them very well or very strongly. And its placements in divisional charts are all destroyed if you made that judgment. In fact, it was in the Venus Mahadasha that he first became rather successful and well known for his artistic work. Right? So, I mean, I could show you so many examples of this that made me conclude, hey, you can't state that dogmatically. You see?
Mark?
Yes.
What about Venus potentially being in Kazimi?
Well, I mean, Nilima brought up that point, and technically, all right, it's not within 1 degree. If I'm seeing this correctly, Venus is at 23.7, the Sun is at 24, 23. It's nearly within a degree, but it's not within a degree. And again, exactly when that kind of heart of the sun effects really takes place is a bit of an open question, right?
According to classical orrery, Western astrology, Kazimi is within 30 minutes of arc and a plane.
Right. It uses even less of an orb, right?
Yeah.
It uses even less, and I'm aware of that, Peter. But what's important to me here in qualifying Venus and seeing truly the kind of results it could give, or can it give results in some sort of strong way, is its swap placement in Navamsha. And I think then if you look also at Vimshapaka Bala, that how many times it falls in good divisions in Dasavarga, you'll see that it's potent, right? In that, in my experience, you're not going to say that, Venus is burnt here in such a way that it's impotent.
Yogic, it's a part of Saraswati Yoga, as somebody mentioned. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So, Mark, I have a question about the third house.
About which? About which
house? In D11.
The 7th house, are you saying? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Third.
The 3rd house.
Right. In several charts, you showed the planet were in the 3rd house, which I consider very bad. Probably the worst of all.
Let me again make sure I'm understanding what you're saying. You're saying you consider the 3rd house the worst?
Yes, in D11.
In D11. And you would consider that because? Why would you consider it to be the worst?
This is what I said.
Specifically for D11, you said it's the worst?
The 3rd house is at least as bad as 8 or something like that.
Well, what he refers to them as, again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, who've studied Ira's work as well, that they're transition houses, right? And again, if I would see a major period lord here, this would be a different interpretation. But what I'm looking at more particularly is the major period lord being the moon and its condition here. Anyway, it's the only way I can respond to that. I don't Well, I'd have to go back and look. I don't, not disavowing what you're saying, but I don't know that he calls them the worst houses. You know?
Mark, I think Aya was talking about the fact that, you know, the third house is not one of the favorable houses, and
it's a dushtan. It's also 8th from the 8th.
It's the 8th from the 8th, which has to do with transition and, you know,
right.
Doesn't it, retirement of some sort.
I'm familiar with all that, right? And I've actually showed some of the utility of that principle in judging periods in D10 in my book, Seekers of Dashamsha, for when people make career transitions or when they lose their careers or retire or anything, that sort of thing, right? So anyway, going on here, because there's just a couple more. Hermann Hesse, it was a German author or Swiss author, I'm sorry, who also won a Nobel Prize, and I believe it was in Moon Jupiter. And, you know, that's pretty obvious from the birth chart. Why would it be obvious? Moon Jupiter. Remember, you got it for authorship.
Yeah. Jupiter's the 5th lord, and it's in Sagittarius, in its own sign, and Moon's in the 5th house.
And is there any yoga that they're forming that you might not make note of?
Kesari.
Kesari yoga. And what then really adds to this, particularly from a perspective of authorship, the fact that, well, who are the two grahas?
Jupiter and Mercury.
Mercury and Jupiter.
And of course, they're both swa here, and they're all
aspecting each other.
Yes, either aspecting or in Kendra Sambandha from each other, right? So
plus, getting a Buddhaditya yoga to Mercury.
Buddhaditya yoga, you know, well,
in the 8th house, but whatever.
Well, and you know, I don't know how Penny or Hart was defining, but I only see Buddhaditya yoga, the Sun Mercury combination, if somehow the 1st house and the 5th house are involved, right? Which, you know, I don't really see that here. Mm-hmm. But if you look at Moon Jupiter here in D11, again, I believe it obviously very much supports the idea of a period and sub-period when he could be honored, right? Mm-hmm. The Moon here in the 9th house and Jupiter, Swakshetra, in the 10th house with the additional influence of an exalted natural benefic. Okay.
Sun Moon forming Shubha Sankhya again.
And good. The Sun Moon, she's saying that because the Moon and the Sun are equidistant from the Lagna Gemini, that is, one's in the 5th house, one's in the 9th house, and they are the Sun and the Moon, which according to Iyer then form a good Sankhya Yoga, a Shubha Sankhya Yoga. And then this is an additional qualification as to why the Moon period, as indicated here in D11, could give him such an honor. So again, you're always good at identifying these Niyaman. I appreciate it. Okay, so the last chart we're going to look at is of the Irish poet and dramatist William Butler Yeats, who also, you know, his birth time comes from the 19th century, but it came from a family Bible record, which means to me that it might have been noted more precisely. We can't know that for sure, but it's usually better off than, you know, just otherwise. He won his Nobel Prize for Literature in his Mercury period, which, you know, just based on the Rashi, what strikes you about that?
5th Lord in the
9th Lord in the 5th.
It's, you know, the rule of the 9th and the 5th. It's in the 5th, number one, right? You know, one of the houses of authorship, obviously. Now, for those of you who know the combinations for authorship given in the Jaimini Sutra, for successful authorship, who is the Karakamsa? Who's the planet with the highest degrees here?
Moon.
Venus. Moon, sorry.
Moon. Yeah.
The Moon, and let's place it in Navamsha.
Virgo.
It goes to Virgo. So the 1st and the 5th house, they get the aspect of the Moon and Jupiter.
Right. So Draven, who's studying Jaimini with me, so it's fresh in his mind, knows that in the Jaimini Sutra it says that from Karkamsha Lagna, which would here be Virgo, if the first or the fifth in there has the influence of the natural benefics Jupiter, Mercury, and Venus, or especially the Moon and Jupiter, then a person becomes a successful author. So Virgo, using Rashi Dristi, using sign aspect, Jupiter, the Karkamsha, Virgo, the Karkamsha Lagna gets the aspect of a very strong Jupiter. You'll find Jupiter not only in its Mula Trikona sign here, but if you looked at many, many divisional charts, it's going to remain in Sagittarius. Paladipika highlights this sort of degree of Jupiter in particular for giving such strong results. And then the fifth from Virgo has the Moon. And then what house getting Rashi Dristi, or what planet getting Rashi Dristi is also aspecting Capricorn?
Mercury.
Mercury. So you see here that Jupiter, Moon, and Mercury are all connected to the Karkamsha Lagna, or the fifth from there, and showing the Jaimini, from the Jaimini point of view, the potential and static potential for successful authorship, where he certainly was. Now, coming back to the fact that in Vimshotri, he got his Nobel Prize for Literature in Mercury. What strikes you?
Mercury, Jupiter from Shubha Sankhya. Mercury in the fifth house of writing.
I can rely on you for these, Nilima. First of all, Mercury is well placed in the fifth house, and it's in Jupiter's sign aspected by Jupiter. Never not see this Sambandha. It's a very strong Sambandha. And, as Niliman pointed out, it's two natural benefics equidistant from the Lagna here, 5-9, forming this thing called Shubha Sankhya Yoga, which is one of the ways Iyer is really qualified planets capable of giving very strong and favorable results in the divisional charts. So there's our first webinar in this year's, or this new 12-month cycle of the Jyotish journey. I loved all the participation. Maybe next time, those who are so participatory this time will hang back a little bit and let others. Right? I'm not making a critical comment. I'm just saying that, we want to give others a chance as well. But I certainly appreciate the participation. Is there any final questions about what was given in those articles, or anything that was discussed today to clarify or comment about? Make a question. Anything.
Would you look at a soul enemy at all?
Okay, so Nilima is talking about a principle that Iyer used, where each planet has what's called a soul enemy, not soul S-O-U-L, but soul S-O-L-E, meaning, it's only that planet that is, and I believe, Saturn for the Sun, or the Sun for Saturn, or Mars.
Yeah, 6 away from whatever the graha is.
Mars for Mercury. And so this is a principle of Iyer's, and, taught by people like Hart Defoe and strong disciples of his like Penny Farrow. And it may very well be a good and valid principle. I just have to be honest about the fact that I have not researched that principle. But I have some questions about it, and here's why. Jupiter and Venus are soul enemies, or Jupiter's the soul enemy of Venus?
No, Venus is Jupiter's enemy. So if Venus is in Jupiter's sign, aspected by Jupiter, it's an enemy sign aspected by an enemy. That becomes a worse thing.
Okay, now I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to bring up a chart here. And it's going to be the chart of another major Hollywood movie star, if I can get it up here, named Tommy Lee Jones. And this is just one of many examples that I could pull up, but I'm just pulling up this one. Tommy Lee Jones. Okay. And let me get up a different screen here. Bigger screen. and get rid of all the I'm going to get the birth data here and also degrees of planets. So what really highly unusual yoga is formed by, or not very common yoga, rather rare yoga, formed by the planets in his sixth house. Does anybody recognize that?
Makuta
Viparit Raj Yoga.
A very special Viparit Raj Yoga, because what you have here is all the lords of the trick houses, 6, 8, 12, in Adusthana, in this case the sixth, and there aren't any other house lords that aren't trick house lords that are a part of this combination. Does everyone see that?
Mm-hmm.
This is the full Viparit Raj Yoga that's talked about in the one classic, Uttara Kamalita. I forget exactly the name of it. So, and it's not a common thing. But, you know, and obviously Venus has a source of strength here. And he won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, I think, in the movie The Fugitive, if I'm remembering correctly, in his major period of Jupiter and the sub-period of Venus, okay? So you see that that's a period and sub-period of two planets here in his, forming this special Viparit Raj Yoga. But if I show you D10 here, just a moment. I show you D10. What do you notice about Jupiter and Venus, Neelima?
Well, Venus is in the Rashi of Jupiter, aspected by Jupiter. So.
Right. And, you know, first of all, you know, the major period lord is well placed relative to this division. It's in the good ninth house, right? And the sub-period when he won the award is Venus in its exaltation sign, but also Jupiter sign aspected by Jupiter. Now, according to the principles I talk about in my Secrets of the Shapsha, this is just exactly the kind of period that is going to give such good results. But if you are, you know, applying this idea of the soul enemy, would you predict these kind of results based on this division?
Not really. I mean,
not really. And so what I'm telling you is that I could show you example after example of this. So this is why I'm not saying that the principle is invalid. I'm just saying that if you apply it dogmatically, right, then you'll go wrong. And that's my point.
Thank you.
So this is why, again, you know, it's never a single factor analysis. It's weighing up, you know, any number of factors that come to some sort of final conclusion or judgment. But I'm really glad you asked that question, because others might have had that thought. Okay, anything else before we conclude here?
Mark, on Tommy Lee Jones' chart,
Mm-hmm.
are you familiar whether he had any relationship problems, marriage problems, or something like that?
Do you know any Hollywood movie stars that typically don't have but I don't. You know, I'm sure you can go on Wikipedia and find out about that. But you know, why do you ask? Because of Venus in the why do you ask?
For Taurus Wagner, whenever Venus is in Libra with Jupiter, when you invert to work from Venus, and then you have from Venus, Jupiter and Venus are the 6th and the 8th ward, aspecting the 7th house.
Right, I see, yeah.
In this chart, you have also Saturn aspecting the 7th house from that point of view.
Right. Well, you know, if you just Google his name and Wikipedia comes up, you're going to be able to answer that question. I don't have the answer myself. Okay. All right. Well, unless there's anything else, I think we'll conclude for today.
Mark, I have a question.
Okay.
It's Rick.
Hi, Rick.
Hi. My software has D11 by IRE and the standard version. And I'm wondering what your comment may be on the standard version.
My comment on the standard version would be very ignorant and uninformed because I've never researched it.
Oh,
I've only researched the IR D11.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Mark, I've got a question.
Yes, Drew.
Mark, I use Jagannath Hora as the software to make charts. I wasn't able to find D11. So do you have any comments on that? Is it possible to have D11 on Jagannath Hora?
Yes, I don't use that program. I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know. You might want to contact Narasimha Rao, the developer of that program, through his website where you can download the program from, and he could answer that question for you.
Okay, thank you.
But again, it's a non-Parashari. It's a non-Parashari. So, I'm not surprised that it may not be in there. All right, we are going to conclude. All right, one more question, then we have
one more quickly. This is on the Yogi planet and the duplicate Yogi planet. One of Aya's principles states that if the Yogi planet, duplicate Yogi, is in the Lagna, this is one of the potentials for prosperity.
What contributes to that planet's ability to give prosperity? That's the way I would say it. Okay.
Yes, that's a good way to say it. Thank you. What about if they're in, aspecting the Lagna? For example, if it was Jupiter and it was in a trine to the Lagna, or Saturn in the third aspect, do you think that might possibly be significant?
If he's saying that a relationship of the yogi to the Lagna somehow increases its ability this way, certainly the occupation and aspect, if the occupation does that, it flows logically that the aspect might do that. But of course, that's not what he states.
Right.
So
but it's worth researching.
Potentially, yeah. All right, we will conclude with our Sanskrit prayer today. Ohom masato masa gamaya, tamaso ma jyotir gamaya, mrityor ma mitam gamaya, sarvesham swasti bhavatu, sarvesham shanti bhavatu, sarvesham purnam bhavatu, sarvesham mangalam bhavatu, loka samasta sukino bhavantu, ohom shanti, shanti, shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat.